Today I want to tell you a rags to riches story just like that. Except the main character here is Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And the price of that comeback, tens of millions of lives, leaving a whole world completely consumed by war. I've been digging through a ton of the latest historical research lately, plus the newly declassified archives from Germany and Britain. And the more I read, the more horrified I get. Do you realize how bad things were in Germany when Hitler took power in 1933? Calling it a junk company on the brink of delisting isn't even an exaggeration. First, the foreign debt was absolutely crushing it. The Treaty of Versailles hit it with 132 billion gold marks in war reparations. To put that in perspective, that's about 4.7 trillion in today's dollars. Based on Germany's income back then, even if the entire country stopped spending and worked for nothing, they wouldn't have paid it off until 1988. And that wasn't even the worst of it. After World War I, Germany lost 1/8 of its territory, along with all of its overseas colonies, and its entire supply chain for industrial raw materials was completely cut off. Worse than that was the economy. The hyperinflation of 1923. I checked the historical data from the Deutsche Bundesbank. At its peak, inflation hit 29,000%, and prices doubled every 49 hours. You could walk out in the morning to buy a loaf of bread. It would cost you 100,000 marks, and by evening that same loaf cost 2 million. There's that famous story about a man going shopping. He loaded a wheelbarrow full of cash, and halfway there, robbers stole the money. They stole the cash and left the wheelbarrow. Because the money was worth less than the cart. A middle-class family's life savings, wiped out overnight, turned into worthless paper. Then came the Great Depression in 1929. As soon as American capital pulled out, Germany's economy completely collapsed. When Hitler took power in 1933, there were 6 million unemployed people. The unemployment rate hit 29.9%. Basically, 1 in 3 workers had no job. Those 6 million people weren't just numbers. They were 6 million mouths to feed. Refugees on the edge of rebellion. The situation abroad was even worse. The Treaty of Versailles was like a non-compete agreement that locked Germany down. It capped the German army at 100,000 men. Banned them from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. All its neighbors, France, Britain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, any one of them could have crushed Germany with barely a fight. France had over 100 divisions back then, way more tanks and planes than Germany. If they had actually moved, Germany wouldn't have stood a chance. Think about it. If you took over this mess, what would you do? Could you turn it around in just 6 years? Go from a bankrupt failure to the most powerful war machine in Europe. So scary that the old empires of Britain and France didn't dare fight you? I can't even wrap my head around it, but Hitler did it. Today I want to break down exactly how he pulled this off, and what's hidden behind it that we still need to be wary of today. What was the secret that failed art students stumbled on? A lot of people hear Hitler's name and think he was a madman. A demagogue who tricked everyone with his speeches. And yeah, his oratory was incredible. But if that's all you see, you're missing the whole point. Do you realize that by today's hiring standards, his resume for his first 30 years was that of a total loser? A total loser that no one would ever hire. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts twice and got rejected both times. The first time, in 1907, the examiners looked at his art. They said his landscapes were fine, but his figure drawings were terrible. They told him he wasn't cut out for art school. The second time, in 1908, he got rejected again. After that, he became a homeless vagrant in Vienna, living in shelters, scraping by selling 5-mark postcards, sometimes going days without a proper meal. When World War I broke out, he joined the army. He was brave, even won the Iron Cross, but he kept getting injured. So he barely spent any real time on the front lines. And for his whole life he only ever made it to corporal, never an officer. Think about it. This guy had no degree, no connections, no money. If he sent out a resume today, what company would hire him? Working a 9 to 5 was never gonna happen for him. So he had to start his own thing, he had to start up. And that time he spent scraping by on the bottom. That's the thing those aristocratic generals could never learn their whole lives. It was the core secret to his later success. He understood people. He understood exactly what ordinary people wanted. Those junker aristocrats living in mansions in Berlin, those pampered generals, they had no idea what it was like to go hungry. They had no clue what the middle class was scared of after inflation hit. They didn't know what the generals were craving when they wanted to restore Germany's status as a great power. But Hitler knew, because he had been one of them. He had lived with these people, day in and day out. He had figured out everyone's pain points. In 1923, he tried his first startup, the beer hall putsch. He wanted to do what Mussolini did, seize power by force. But the police crushed it in no time, and he ended up in prison. A lot of people thought the Nazi Party was done. They thought that Hitler was finished for good. But no one expected it. Those 9 months in prison started his comeback. He didn't just sit around, he did a post-mortem. And he wrote that book everyone loves to hate, Mein Kampf. If you write that off as just an anti-Semitic pamphlet, you're wrong. That book was a perfect business plan. It was an answer to one core question. What does the world need from me? He realized that Germans were inherently law-abiding. A violent coup, going against the grain of what people wanted, would never work. So he switched his strategy. He would go the legal route. Win votes, walk into the Chancellery fair and square. So how do you win votes? He split the entire German population into 3 groups, and for each one he built a customized solution, tailored to their core needs. First group, the desperate working class. Those 6 million unemployed workers, the bankrupt farmers. What was their biggest pain point? Hunger and survival. They were preaching about democracy, freedom, and the Constitution. Think about it. If someone hasn't eaten in 3 days, are you gonna tell them about freedom? Do they care? All they care about is where their next meal is coming from. So Hitler's solution was as simple as it gets: bread and work. He told them, "Follow me and I'll make sure everyone has food to eat. And I'll make sure everyone has a job." That one line won all of them over. For someone who's starving, that's a need to have. Nothing else, no fancy empty promises could ever beat that. Second group, the terrified middle class. The small shop owners, the low-level civil servants, the ordinary office workers. These people had their entire life savings wiped out by the 1923 inflation. They had a good life, and overnight it was all gone. What were they scared of most? Chaos and Bolshevism. The Soviet system that would take their little shops, their homes, away from them. They were scared of Jews too. Back then, a lot of bankers were Jewish, and they blamed the Jews for the inflation, for stealing their money. So what Hitler gave them was security. He told them, "It's not your fault your life is this bad." The country was betrayed by bad people. The Jews, the communists. They destroyed our lives. I'll kick all those bad people out and I'll give you stable order. And he had his SA, the stormtroopers, marching through the streets in neat, orderly rows. The middle class saw that and thought, oh, this guy can keep things under control. With him, there won't be chaos. Our lives will be safe again. Just like that, they relaxed and they were ready to support him. Third group, the arrogant elite. The generals of the Wehrmacht, the Junker aristocrats, the industrial giants like Krupp. These people used to look down on Hitler. Thought he was just an uneducated corporal, a little thug. But they had their own pain points. Their ambitions locked up by the Treaty of Versailles. The army generals wanted to rearm, to restore Germany's status as a great power. They didn't want to be stuck with a tiny 100,000-man army forever. The industrialists, their factories were about to go under, no orders, no work. So what Hitler gave them was massive, massive orders. He told these bigwigs privately, "Support me to take power. And you don't have to worry about anything else. Once I'm in, I'll tear up the Treaty of Versailles. And I'll give you all the orders you need. However many cannons or tanks you want to build, I'll buy them all. Your factories will have orders lined up for the next 10 years. See, just like that, he brought three totally opposed groups together. The far-left workers, the far-right aristocrats, and the greedy capitalists were enemies. But Hitler gave each of them exactly what they wanted. And he united all of them under his banner. In 1933, thanks to that terrifyingly precise user segmentation, plus his incredible public speaking, Hitler took power. Does this look familiar? It's exactly the marketing playbook we use today. First you do market research and segment your users, then build customized products for each user's pain points, and then you convert them precisely. Hitler mastered this entire playbook 90 years ago, once he had the domestic market locked down. The next step was the trickier international market. Everyone back then knew Hitler wanted to rearm. He wanted to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. If Britain and France wanted to, they could have crushed him in the cradle. But why was Hitler brave enough to make a move? Because he had already read the minds of Britain and France perfectly. He realized that those two seemingly unbeatable opponents each had their own weaknesses. First is Britain. Their mindset back then was so complicated, mostly starting with guilt. By the 1930s, a lot of British elites thought the treaty was too hard. They thought the Treaty of Versailles had been way too hard on Germany. Former Prime Minister Lloyd George even said that they had pushed Germany too far, and that something would go wrong eventually. They thought it was only natural that Germany would want to push back a little. Then there was war weariness, since Britain lost so many men in the First War. They had 750,000 dead and 1.5 million wounded. An entire generation of young men was just gone. By the 1930s, the British were absolutely terrified of war. Just the thought of fighting made them sick. No one wanted to do it again. But the biggest thing of all was that the British had a bigger fear. They were absolutely terrified of the Soviet Union. To those gentlemen in London, Stalin's communism was way scarier than Hitler. It was much scarier than the little mustache guy. They thought communism was a plague that would spread across all of Europe. So Hitler latched onto that, and he told the British he was their buffer. "I'm the one holding back the Soviets for you. Only a strong Germany can stop Stalin and keep communism from spreading. Letting me rearm is just saving you the cost of your own security. You don't have to spend your own money on an army. You don't have to fight the Soviets. I'll do it for you." That trick worked like an absolute charm. In 1935, Britain actually signed a naval agreement with Germany behind France's back. What was that agreement? It let Germany build a navy. It was 35% the size of Britain's navy. And it even let Germany build U-boats. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles had banned Germany from building submarines entirely. Just like that, Britain tore a huge hole in the entire Versailles system. They basically gave Germany a legal license to rearm. Then there was France, and the French had their own kind of weakness. In the First War, France lost 1.3 million men. That was even more than Britain, another entire generation gone. After the war, France's birth rate never recovered. By the 1930s, their population was less than half of Germany's. They were terrified of fighting Germany, terrified of losing another generation of their young men. So they built the Maginot Line and hid behind it. They thought, as long as you don't attack me, do whatever you want. As long as you don't cross this line, burn down your own yard. For all I care, I'll just pretend I don't see it. Hitler latched right onto that. Every time he broke a treaty, he wrapped it up in national self-determination. He always painted himself as the victim. He said he wasn't invading, he was just bringing his people home. He was just taking back what belongs to Germany. The French saw that and thought, oh, that's nothing. No need to risk our lives over that, it's not hurting us. See, just like that, Hitler had Britain and France wrapped around his finger. He knew that as long as the trouble avoided their doorstep, they would just keep compromising and keep backing down. He had his users locked down. He had his clients figured out. And next up on the list was branding. And hey, that failed art student was a natural at branding. He knew perfectly well how to sell an extreme ideology. You have to package it as something sexy and something sacred, so no one can see the evil underneath. How did he do it? Well, first was the logo. That swastika flag, red background, white circle, black swastika. None of that design was random. Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf himself about the colors. Red is the social meaning of our movement, to win over the left. To make the workers think we represent the working class too. White is nationalism that represents our nation. The black swastika is the struggle of the Aryan race, that's our mission. And he used the black, white, and red colors of the German Empire, not the black, red, and gold of the Weimar Republic. Why? Because a lot of Germans never accepted the Weimar flag. They thought it was the flag of defeat. Using the old colors instantly woke up that old national pride in Germans. The conservatives saw that flag and thought, oh, that's the real German flag. And they were ready to support him. Then there were the uniforms. You know, people still say Nazi uniforms were cool. Hitler personally oversaw that. He hired the best tailors and the best factories, like Hugo Boss. Back then it was just a small workshop making Nazi uniforms. That's exactly how they got their start. The uniforms he designed were tailored, slim fit, and sharp. They made you look instantly put together. Especially the black SS uniforms, with the skull badges and silver accents. The leather boots and that sense of power, it hit you right away. Think about it, a young guy who was unemployed in the Depression. He was insecure, and no one even looked at him on the street. Then he puts on that uniform, those leather boots, and walks down the street. The sharp lines make him look bigger than he is, and people cross the street to get out of his way. In that moment he thinks, I'm not a loser. I'm a soldier for the fatherland, I'm somebody. Just like that, that uniform fixed the young people's core pain point. It completely fixed their insecurity. All those young guys who thought their country was a mess, suddenly they felt like they were part of something bigger. They were fighting to join the party, fighting to join the army. Because wearing that uniform made you look cool, it gave you status. Then there was the grand ceremonial spectacle. You have seen the Cathedral of Light at the Nuremberg rallies, right? Hitler's architect set up 152 anti-aircraft searchlights, all pointing straight up into the sky, creating a massive cathedral of light beams. It looked exactly like a church. Foreign reporters back then said, standing there, I felt tiny as an ant. The awe, you can't even describe it. Below you were 100,000 people, all moving in lockstep, chanting slogans, just like a machine. The British and French diplomats saw that, and their will to fight just broke. They thought, this is an unstoppable force, we can't fight this. That was not enough. Hitler also put on a global PR roadshow. He used the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Did you know the Olympic torch relay we do now? It's not some ancient Greek tradition. It was invented by Hitler's propaganda minister Goebbels. That's right, before that, the Olympics never had a torch relay. Goebbels made up the whole ancient Greek tradition thing, then designed a route from Olympia all the way to Berlin. 3,000 torchbearers running for 12 days, and the entire world's media covered it. He wanted to tell the whole world that modern Germany is the heir to ancient Greek civilization. We're not barbarians, we're civilized. And for the Olympics, Hitler put a full-face beauty filter on Germany. He ordered all the anti-Semitic signs taken down off the streets of Berlin. and all the radical slogans were removed. The whole city was cleaned up spotless. All the Germans were told to be warm and welcoming. He even let a few Jewish athletes compete in the Olympics, just for show. He also hired the most brilliant female director of the time, Leni Riefenstahl, to film Olympia, the movie that captured the beauty of the athletes' bodies perfectly. The whole world watched it, and a lot of people came away thinking, oh, the Nazis are about health, about beauty, Germany's so civilized. Just like that, Hitler packaged anti-Semitism as order, persecution as purification, invasion as epic glory. Does this look familiar? It's exactly modern brand marketing. Logo design, user experience, launch events, content marketing. Hitler mastered all of it 90 years ago. Once the brand was built, next up was testing. Hitler knew he didn't have enough to go all in on a gamble. So he used the exact same method modern tech startups use. Move fast and break things, iterate quickly. In 1933, he tested the first step, withdraw from the League of Nations. What happened? Britain and France did nothing but publish a few articles protesting it. Hitler saw that and thought about their reaction. Oh, so protesting is the most you guys are gonna do? Then in 1935, he publicly tore up the Treaty of Versailles, reintroduced conscription, expanded the army from 100,000 to 300,000 men, and he built an air force. That was a blatant slap in the face, and what happened? Britain and France still did absolutely nothing. Britain even sent over that naval agreement we talked about. Hitler knew then, the time was right, it was time for a bigger test. That bigger test was the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. The Rhineland was German territory, but the Treaty of Versailles said otherwise. It had to be a demilitarized zone. Germany couldn't station troops there. It was a security buffer for France. If Germany moved troops in, that was like pointing a gun right at France's chest. What was the German army actually like back then? According to declassified archives later, those few thousand German troops they sent over, a lot of them were riding bicycles, driving unarmored training trucks. Each soldier only had 5 bullets. It was all a bluff. Meanwhile, France had 13 divisions on the border, over 300 tanks. If France had wanted to, they could have crushed those German troops like ants. Hitler was scared himself. He sent a secret order to the front commander. If France so much as looks like they're gonna move, you retreat immediately. Run as fast as you can, absolutely no hesitation. Back in Berlin, he was so nervous he was biting his nails. And what happened? France was in the middle of an election. They had a caretaker cabinet. No one wanted to go to war right then. The army generals said, if we fight, we need full mobilization. That'll cost a ton of money and we have to draft ordinary people. The politicians heard that, spend money, upset voters, and they folded immediately. Then they turned to Britain and asked, hey, what do you think? Britain just brushed it off and said to let it go. Come on, the Germans are just going for a walk in their own backyard. Just like that, no one did a single thing. Those few thousand German troops just marched right into the Rhineland. They walked in like they owned the place. That was a huge win for Hitler. First, all those old generals who used to look down on him. They were shocked, they said, that worked, the Führer is a genius. Hitler's prestige in the army went through the roof overnight. More importantly, he saw exactly what Britain and France's bottom line was. He realized they were nothing but paper tigers. For a little short-term stability, for their own votes, they would gladly sell out any principle. As long as I'm tough enough, they'll just back down. After the Rhineland, Hitler realized he had 2 more problems. First, he was too isolated. He had no friends on the international stage. Second, all those new tanks and planes he had built, they were just lab prototypes. They hadn't been tested in real combat. No one actually knew if they worked. So first, he looked for allies. He scanned the world and found 2 other outcasts, 2 troublemakers. Mussolini in Italy and the Empire of Japan. He told Mussolini, the regular club won't let us in. So let's make our own club, the Berlin-Rome Axis. Then with Japan he signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. Don't think that pact was actually about fighting communism. It was just marketing, strictly for Britain's benefit. Hitler wanted to tell Britain, look, me and Japan, we're holding back the Soviets for you, we're blocking that plague. I am completely on your side. The British conservatives saw that and thought, oh right, Hitler's holding back the Soviets for us, that's great. And they relaxed even more. Then the opportunity came. The Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936. Hitler saw that and thought, perfect, that's a free weapons testing ground. He immediately sent the Condor Legion over. Officially they were volunteers, but really they were there to test new weapons. Panzer I tanks, Bf-109 fighters, Stuka dive bombers. All of it got dragged to Spain, tested with live ammo. For the Stuka dive bombers, the Germans even put a siren on the landing gear. They called it the Jericho trumpet. When it dove, it made that screaming sound, like a banshee. It scared people to death before the bomb even hit. That is pure psychological warfare. The climax of that test was the bombing of Guernica. April 26, 1937, it was a Monday. Market day in the small town, the busiest day of the week. The Condor Legion bombed the entire town to the ground. First they dropped high explosives, then incendiaries. Then they strafed the fleeing civilians with machine guns. You know, when the German president visited Spain in 2025, he formally apologized for this. He said, Germans can never forget the crimes we committed. Why did Hitler do that? Besides testing the incendiary bombs, it was terror marketing. He sent the horror of Guernica to the newspapers in Britain and France to tell them, look, this is what my bombing can do. If you go to war with me, this is what your city will look like. That trick worked perfectly. The British public saw it, and they were terrified. 70% of them said, don't intervene in Spain, don't go to war. The British and French governments said the exact same thing. Why risk burning our own capital to the ground over Spain? It's simply not worth it. Hitler saw that, and he was satisfied. He checked a box in his little notebook. Product testing passed, customer intimidation successful. Once the product testing was done, next up was hostile takeovers. First up, Austria, his home country. Austria was a sovereign country, but Hitler swallowed it without firing a single shot. Because the Nazi Party in Austria had already destabilized the government. Hitler forced the Austrian chancellor to step down, or he'd invade. Then in March 1938, the German army marched right into Vienna. And guess what? A lot of the Austrian people welcomed them. Because after the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell, Austria had been poor for years. A lot of people wanted to unite with Germany. They thought that would give them a better life. So when the German troops marched in, a lot of people brought them flowers. And they cheered for Hitler. Just like that, Hitler annexed Austria without firing a shot. He gained 7 million people, plus Austria's iron mines, its gold reserves. He got way stronger overnight. Next up, Czechoslovakia. Don't let that small country fool you. It was actually a hidden max-level character. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell, Czechoslovakia got 80% of the empire's heavy industry. The crown jewel, the Skoda works. You look at Skoda now, you think it's just a car brand under Volkswagen. But back then, it was one of the 3 biggest arms factories in the world. Right up there with Krupp and Schneider. In 1938, Skoda's arms production alone was massive. It was bigger than all of Britain's arms factories combined. And Czechoslovakia had spent 10 years building its own little Maginot line. Hundreds of bunkers, 35 elite divisions. If Hitler had tried to attack head-on, he never would have broken through. And he would have destroyed the arms factory in the process. But Hitler never planned to attack head-on. He used the same old trick, manipulating Britain and France. He used the Sudetenland as an excuse. He said there were 3 million Germans there, they were suffering. They wanted to come home. He said this is national self-determination. That's the principle President Wilson made himself. How dare you stop it? He used Britain and France's own values against them. Then he massed troops on the border, yelled about going to war. He cranked up the fear of war to the max. And Chamberlain took the bait, flying to Germany 3 times. The old prime minister went to meet with Hitler to negotiate. Hitler knew Chamberlain would sell anything for peace. Defending Czechoslovakia meant putting hundreds of thousands of soldiers at risk. It meant having London bombed to the ground, losing everything. But selling out Czechoslovakia was just signing a piece of paper. No one dies, and you get peace. Finally, in September 1938, the Munich Conference happened. Germany, Britain, France, and Italy sat down to split the cake. They locked the actual country involved, Czechoslovakia, out of the room. They signed the agreement and gave the Sudetenland to Germany. Hitler promised that this was his last territorial demand. Chamberlain flew back to London, holding up that piece of paper. He told the cheering crowds he had brought peace for our time. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the war was avoided. But they didn't know the German generals were already planning a coup. They knew the German army couldn't beat their combined forces. If Britain and France had just said no, they would have arrested Hitler. But then Chamberlain handed them the Sudetenland, shocking those generals. They thought Hitler was a prophet, completely unstoppable. No one dared to oppose him after that. Once he had the Sudetenland, Hitler didn't stop. 6 months later, he tore up his promise entirely. He annexed the entire rest of Czechoslovakia, waking everyone up. They realized Hitler wasn't just bringing his people home. He was invading, and all his promises were lies. The policy of appeasement was completely, totally dead. But it was too late. Hitler already had the Skoda works. Germany's arms production doubled overnight, giving him enough money and power. He was finally ready to fight an even bigger war. After annexing Czechoslovakia, Hitler's next target was Poland. But he was scared of fighting a 2-front war. So he needed to stabilize the East, the Soviet Union. Normally, the Nazis and the Soviets were mortal enemies, right? Hitler rose to power by anti-communism, while Stalin yelled about defeating fascism. How could they work together when they hated each other? But when it comes to interests, ideology is just paper. Stalin had wanted to ally with Britain and France, but at the Munich Conference, they treated him like he didn't exist. Stalin realized they were trying to push the war east. They wanted Germany to fight the Soviets, letting them kill each other. Well, if you're going to be that way, don't blame me. So in August 1939, the world thought they would go to war. Instead, the German foreign minister flew to Moscow. They signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with a secret agreement. They split Poland between them, Germany getting the west. The Soviets got the east, and they split up the Baltic states. When the news broke, the whole world was shocked. Leftists in London, communists in Paris, old Nazis in Berlin. They were all completely stunned by this. These 2 mortal enemies, how did they just team up? But for Hitler, that meant the Eastern Front was secure. He didn't have to worry about a 2-front war anymore. He could attack Poland, absolutely no problem. And by this point, his Nazi company was running out of cash. A 2024 study shows they issued 12 billion marks in MIFO bills. Those were hidden off-the-books debts. That was 15% of Germany's entire GDP back then. Their foreign currency reserves were down to less than 100 million, and they were about to run out of raw materials. What are MIFO bills, you might ask? They were a shell company the Nazis set up. They issued promissory notes to arms factories to dodge debt limits. This allowed them to rearm in complete secret. It was basically a Ponzi scheme, borrowing new money to pay the old. If they didn't start a war and rob other countries for cash, the bubble would pop and the whole company would go bankrupt. So attacking Poland wasn't something Hitler wanted to do. He had to do it, or he was finished. So how do you attack Poland, a country that wasn't small? It had the fourth largest army in Europe, 1 million tough troops. If they used the old trench warfare, Germany couldn't afford it. He desperately needed a quick win. So he rolled out a revolutionary new product, Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. The product manager for this was Heinz Guderian. Back then, Europe thought tanks were just babysitters for infantry. They just followed foot soldiers to help block bullets. But Guderian said no, tanks are the main event. You gather all the tanks together into one giant fist. Punch straight through the enemy's weak spot, ignoring the flanks. Ignore the enemies behind you, charge straight for the command center. Blow up their brain and cut off their supplies. That way, no matter how many enemy troops you have up front, they will be completely paralyzed. A lot of generals thought he was crazy, but Hitler saw it instantly. This was fast, winning with a smaller force, exactly what Germany needed. So he threw all his support behind Guderian to build this. People think the German tanks were super advanced, but that's not true. In 1939, the main German tanks were the Panzer I and II. The Panzer I only had 2 machine guns. The Panzer II only had a 20mm cannon. Their armor was so thin, anti-tank rifles could punch right through them. So what did they win with? Radio. That was the real black technology. A 2024 paper notes Guderian put a radio in every single German tank. Even the smallest Panzer I had a receiver. For platoon leaders and above, they had two-way radios. To fix the noise inside the tank, they invented throat microphones. They stuck to your throat, picking up your vocal cords directly. So even if it was loud outside, your voice came through clear. Meanwhile, Poland only had radios in 3% of their tanks. France only had 10%, communicating by yelling and flag signals. They couldn't coordinate at all. So the German tanks weren't just separate machines, they were a connected network. The commander sat in his command car like he was playing Red Alert. He had a God view of the whole battlefield, orders going out instantly. Hundreds of tanks could group up or split up in a second. Meanwhile, Polish commanders were still sending messages via horseback messengers. By the time the message got there, the position was already lost. And there was air support coordination too. The Germans embedded Air Force liaison officers right with the armor troops. This meant they could call the planes directly. There's a bunker up ahead, just call in the Stukas. They'll blow it up in minutes. This kind of air-ground coordination Britain and France couldn't even imagine. That was a level of warfare no one had ever seen before. On September 1, 1939, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. To get an excuse, he even staged the Gliwice incident. He took a few death row inmates, dressing them in Polish uniforms. They pretended to attack a German radio station, claiming Poland had invaded. Then the Blitzkrieg hit Poland like a truck. 28 days later, Poland was completely occupied. That's when Britain and France finally woke up and declared war. But of course, it was already too late. That mess of a country, that bankrupt junk company. In just 6 years, it turned into the most terrifying force in Europe. See, all the stuff Hitler used, does it look familiar? User segmentation, precision marketing, branding, small tests, terror marketing, hostile takeovers. Aren't these all things we see in business all the time? But the difference is, Hitler used all of it for the darkest possible ends. He relied on lies, on robbery, on murder, and he dragged the whole world into hell. When I was researching all this, the more I read, the more horrified I got. Turns out human nature hasn't changed at all in thousands of years. Greed, fear, insecurity, if you figure those out, you can manipulate people easily. And those amazing comeback stories, they might be hiding darkness you can't even imagine. And the lesson of appeasement hasn't changed, even today. Appeasing evil only makes evil bigger. You think you can back down one step to get peace. But in the end, he'll put a knife to your throat. And there's no such thing as free success. All shortcuts have a price tag. That fake prosperity Hitler built with debt, with robbery, with lies, in the end, the whole world had to pay for it, with tens of millions of lives. This isn't some inspirational startup story, it's a warning we can never forget. When you master the manipulation of human nature, the only thing you bring is destruction.